In a stunning geopolitical development, China appears to be distancing itself from Russia at a moment when the Kremlin is facing unprecedented pressure from the West. Multiple diplomatic sources indicate that Beijing has quietly scaled back certain forms of economic and military cooperation with Moscow, a move that could significantly alter the global balance of power. This shift comes as Europe, under mounting pressure from both Washington and its own security concerns, takes aggressive steps to counter Russian influence and limit the flow of resources fueling Moscow's war machine. For months, Western analysts had warned that the close partnership between Russia and China could serve as a strategic lifeline for Vladimir Putin. Following the start of the war in Ukraine, Moscow turned increasingly to Beijing for trade, technology, and a political counterweight to Western sanctions. China, for its part, saw Russia as both a major supplier of discounted energy and a strategic ally in countering U.S. dominance. But recent developments suggest this relationship is showing signs of strain. Insiders familiar with high-level talks between Chinese and Russian officials reveal that Beijing has begun quietly reducing purchases of Russian oil and gas. This is partly due to fears of secondary sanctions from the European Union and the United States, which have stepped up enforcement measures against entities that help Moscow bypass restrictions. In addition, China's own slowing economy has made its leadership more cautious about entangling the country in conflicts that could further damage its access to Western markets. Diplomatic channels indicate that during recent summits, Chinese officials expressed frustration over Russia's inability to bring the Ukraine conflict to a negotiated resolution. According to reports, Beijing is increasingly concerned that prolonged instability in Eastern Europe is pushing the global economy toward recession, undermining China's export-driven growth model. This concern has been amplified by a sharp decline in European demand for Chinese goods, a trend partly driven by Europe's broader reorientation of supply chains away from authoritarian regimes. On the European front, the response to Russia's continued aggression has reached new levels of intensity. In recent weeks, the European Union announced a sweeping package of sanctions targeting not just Russian banks and energy firms, but also logistics companies, insurers, and technology providers that have been facilitating trade with Moscow. The new measures include tighter controls on dual-use goods that could be repurposed for military use, as well as expanded blacklists of individuals linked to Russia's war effort. Perhaps most significant is the EU's decision to ramp up its defense cooperation and weapons production, signaling a long-term commitment to countering Russian power. European leaders have pledged billions in funding to increase domestic arms manufacturing, reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, and accelerate deliveries of military aid to Ukraine. This rapid militarization is seen by many as a clear message to both Moscow and its allies that Europe is prepared for a prolonged standoff. The shift in China's posture toward Russia has not gone unnoticed in Western capitals. U.S. and European officials are cautiously optimistic that Beijing's cooling relationship with Moscow could create new openings for diplomatic engagement. However, they remain wary, noting that China continues to maintain a significant trade relationship with Russia, particularly in areas less exposed to sanctions. Washington has made it clear that any Chinese company caught violating sanctions will face severe consequences, a warning that appears to have resonated with Beijing's leadership. Economic data paints a revealing picture. Russian exports to China have declined for 3 consecutive months, with energy shipments seeing the steepest drop. Analysts attribute this partly to falling global prices, but also to a deliberate slowdown in Chinese purchases. Meanwhile, Chinese investment in Russian infrastructure projects has stalled, and several planned joint ventures in technology and manufacturing have been quietly shelved. The Kremlin, for its part, has downplayed any suggestion of tension with Beijing. Russian state media continues to portray the partnership as strong and mutually beneficial, highlighting ongoing cultural exchanges and symbolic diplomatic visits. Yet behind the scenes, Moscow is said to be growing concerned about its increasing dependence on a partner that may not be as reliable as once thought. Europe's intensified countermeasures have also put Russia in a more precarious position. With access to Western technology and capital now almost entirely cut off, Moscow is struggling to maintain production in key industries. Sanctions on microchips, industrial machinery, and aviation parts have crippled sectors of the Russian economy that once relied heavily on imports. Efforts to substitute these with Chinese goods have only partially succeeded, and the quality gap has caused significant disruptions. At the same time, Europe is forging closer ties with other major players in Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and India, in an effort to build a broader coalition capable of countering both Russian and Chinese influence. These partnerships have expanded beyond trade to include security cooperation, intelligence sharing, and coordinated sanctions policies. For China, the calculation is becoming increasingly complex. While Beijing values its strategic relationship with Moscow as a counterweight to U.S. influence, it also recognizes that being too closely aligned with an increasingly isolated Russia could jeopardize its long-term economic ambitions. The Chinese leadership's priority remains stability at home, and with the country facing mounting debt, sluggish growth, and rising youth unemployment, avoiding secondary sanctions and preserving access to global markets is becoming more important than symbolic geopolitical alliances. The coming months will be crucial in determining whether this apparent cooling of relations between China and Russia becomes a permanent shift or merely a temporary recalibration. Much will depend on the trajectory of the war in Ukraine, the effectiveness of European sanctions, and Beijing's ability to balance its competing interests. What is clear is that Europe's harder line is already having ripple effects far beyond the continent. By tightening sanctions enforcement and stepping up military aid to Ukraine, European leaders are sending a powerful signal that they will not tolerate attempts to undermine the global order. And by forcing China to think twice about its support for Russia, they may be reshaping the geopolitical landscape in ways that will reverberate for years to come. For now, the world is watching closely as two of the most powerful authoritarian states in the world navigate a relationship that was once touted as having no limits. Whether those limits have now been reached remains one of the defining questions of the current era.